See, you got the Western media pushing this narrative that the African governments are not really caring about the Ukrainians, not much less condemning Russia. Now, I'm going to read you this article from Al Jazeera, which is also part of the Western media, that's dated March 23rd, 2022. Why Africa does not appear to be standing with Ukraine. Stand with Ukraine is not just a humanitarian statement, it's also a political one too. And I'm going to explain that in detail later. There have been many comments about Africans' reactions to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the horrific violence it has unleashed on Ukrainians, and the humanitarian catastrophe it has created. Many people, including on this continent, have been against at what they see as the moral failure not just of African governments, but also of individual Africans to outrightly condemn Russia for its clear and unwarranted aggression, as well as its imperial and colonial designs on other people's land, with which they should be all too familiar. Africans, including myself, who have pointed out the racist hypocrisies of Western media, governments, and societies evident in the response, have been accused of a convenient whataboutism which blinds us to the suffering of Ukrainians. Further, others have suggested that Africans are guilty of similar hypocrisies to those they accuse the West of, seemingly more concerned about events and crises thousands of miles away, but happy to ignore the many crises on their own doorstep. Much of this is true. At the UN General Assembly, African countries formed a significant proportion of countries either abstaining from or opposing a resolution to condemn the Russian actions. On social media, one regularly encounters posts expressing explicit support for Russia. Even though while reciting talking points such as NATO expansion and that the West has done similar things, most seem unable to articulate why that justifies the killing and maiming of thousands of civilians, the destruction of lives and livelihoods, and the displacement of millions. And it is true that even as Africans point to preferential treatment accorded to Ukrainians over migrants from less white parts of the world, there is much less talk about what African states themselves are doing to welcome refugees and the displaced from conflicts closer to home. You do not, as a rule, hear about private efforts by Africans such as myself to organize convoys to ferry Tigri- Tigrians to Kenya, or people taking Somali refugees into their homes, as many across Europe are doing with regard to Ukrainians, though many will, I'm sure, point out that significantly fewer of these good white people were sending convoys opening up homes when there was darker folks at the border. Many Africans have failed to see the commonalities between their struggles against imperialism and that of the Ukrainians, preferring to instead conflate the Ukrainians with their benefactors in Western Europe. Excuse me. Indeed, many, including myself, are almost entirely ignorant of the history of Russian colonialism in Eastern Europe and the fear it still inspires in the region. Worse, even today's conflict in which Ukrainians are trapped and dying, and which increasingly looks like a proxy conflict between the West and Russia, of the sort Africans should be immediately, intimately familiar with, struggles to be recognized given that the victims are of lighter hue than has been the case previously. However, it is also true that many who rightfully criticize African responses themselves fail to recognize that African governments are making many of the same calculations that Western ones are. Just as the West is unwilling to sever its energy ties to Moscow for fear of what it means for their own economies and citizens, excuse me, Africa will hedge its bets, especially countries in the eastern part of the continent like Kenya, which gets up to 90% of its wheat imports from Russia and Ukraine. Further, they seem unable to recognize that what the world looks like to a large extent depends on where one is standing, and that many here are responding not to so much the invasion itself, but rather to Western reactions to it, which have rekindled long-running grievances that much of Africa has had with the West, the minimizing of Ukrainian states' racism against African students trying to flee the conflict, with the Ukrainian ambassador to the UK even suggesting that black people in Ukraine should be less visible, as wrinkled as has the hypocrisy and welcoming Ukrainian refugees while shutting out African and Middle Eastern ones. Ditto the gnashing of teeth over Ukrainian suffering and lionizing their resistance, while pledging unconditional support to invaders like Israel and diminishing the similar resistance of Palestinians, whom a UN rapporteur acknowledged are victims of apartheid regimen. Sure, none of this justifies what Russia is doing, but it does sadly make standing with Ukraine, which the West is now presenting as a reflection of itself and its own values, rather less palatable. An example of this was the valorization by the West of the Kenyan ambassador's speech at the UN Secretary at the launch of the invasion, which, while correctly condemning it, used language that appeared to endorse the Western colonial project in Africa. As I argued here, similarly, many may fear that standing with Ukraine could be conflated with standing with the West, and indeed many in Western media seem to think it is. Delving a bit deeper, I think there's also a reaction in these parts to a perception that we in underdeveloped societies have been fed for a long time, since the days of the civilizing mission about the locations of dysfunction. It was a perception evident in the pearl-clutching report of Western journalists shocked that such senseless death and destruction could be visited on civilized Europe, and the visceral reaction this provoked. Maybe, after centuries of being treated as dregs of humanity, many are simply relieved that Europe, here again, there is much ignorant conflation of what European and whiteness are, is getting a taste of what they have wreaked elsewhere. Finally, I think there is also a conflict between those who see the global attention and Western reactions to Ukraine as an opportunity to also talk about other issues, and those say that with Ukraine fighting for its life, such whataboutism should be parked for another time. Yet, does anyone think that once the fighting ends, the West will look more favorably upon the people in the places like Gaza, or on the plight of non-Ukrainian asylum seekers in Europe, or the racism faced by black students, which did not begin with this conflict? If we cannot talk about the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement to end international support for Israel's oppression of Palestinians at the time when the West is imposing wide-ranging sanctions on Russia for doing the same to Ukraine, when can we do it? Why shouldn't countries at the General Assembly, when pushed to stand with Ukraine, ask, what about Palestine? There will be those who will say, whataboutism costs Ukrainian lives by diluting international resolve, but doesn't silence cost Palestinian lives? From a human standpoint, I doubt that anyone would disagree that the Russian invasion is unmitigated catastrophe, but stand with Ukraine is not just a human statement, it is a political one too, and so far the political conversation on both sides appear to be winning out. Well, this is his own expression. I'm going to tell you how I feel about it. I can give a fuck less about the Ukraine. I can give a fuck less about Europe because Europe has never been civilized. Why should we have to care about a country who was part of the Berlin Contract of 1884 to 1885, which divided up Africa? And not to mention Russia was also involved in that. Why would I care about a country like the Ukraine who embodies neo-Nazism and racism against African people? Why should African countries and government be forced to care about some white people? Because them same white people didn't care about the invasion of African countries. Come on. This is a double standard right here. You want to talk about this is a human statement where thousands of Ukrainians are dying. What about the thousands of African brothers and sisters who was dying in their own land when these European countries came in and started dividing it up? I don't care about the Ukraine. As far as I'm concerned, they can blow it off the map. I wouldn't give a fuck less. Because the only time they talk about humanity is when it's something that's happening to white people. But when stuff happens to black people, oh, just forget about it and all that stuff. Like, they still look at us as 3/5 of human beings. And see, if the African government would have been doing their job, none of our people would have had to go to all these European countries. I mean, they just call it for what it is. So, again, where is the humanity that Ukraine is showing the African brothers and sisters? But we supposed to care about what happens to the white people over there. I can care less what happens to them. I can't express that enough. And I know I'm repeating myself. As far as I'm concerned, it's just more white on white crime. As usual, our people are stuck in the middle. What about Hampton University extending free room and board and tuition to 50 to 100 Ukrainian students? How come that's not being extended to the African students that are in the Ukraine? How about how the African people are being treated in Poland? And we're supposed to care about what happens to them? They don't care about what happens to us. This notion that we're supposed to care about what happens to some damn white people when they've been displacing our people for centuries. You're talking about caring for people who embody neo-Nazism. You can't possibly think that we are this stupid. What we need to be doing right now is taking advantage of more this white on white crime and focusing and fixing our issues. Never mind the Ukrainians, never mind the Russians. Because they'll be dealt with soon enough. And the notion that the U.S. wants the African countries to care about what happens to the white folks and opening up their doors. No, we don't have to open up their doors. Fuck the United States. Fuck Ukraine. And fuck Russia. Fuck Europe. Well, I'm going to care about some white people that don't give a damn about my people. And they exploiting my people. And they killing my people. They beating my people. They lynching my people. And I'm supposed to have compassion for some white folks who embody neo-Nazism? Talking about humanity? Isn't it? This don't even make any sense. Why we gotta be humane towards people who are not humane towards us? And I'm gonna leave it right there. You can like, comment, subscribe to the video. See, this is why I don't like reading Western media, because they always pushing a narrative that we're supposed to care about what happens to their people, what our people suffer, and they steal it from our people. Leave your thoughts, leave your comments below. Don't fall for this BS that the Western media is pushing. Let Russia and Ukraine fight their own battle. My brothers and sisters in Africa. If you don't care about what happens with them, hey, you're doing just fine. But you need to focus on fixing the issues you causing within your own country. And I love my brothers and sisters in Africa. And once the country fix the issues, there would be no reason for our people to even leave the motherland that we call Africa. And I'm done.